So the first letter, S, stands for space out your studying. I asked my group of 45 top students what their #1 study technique was, and I was really surprised by how similar and very simple their answers were. Most of them said things like, study a little at a time, don't study one thing for too long, avoid cramming at all costs, and spread out your studying. These homegrown techniques agree very well with what learning experts have been saying for years. They call this technique spacing or space distribution. So what is spacing? Well, let's first see a more accurate definition from one of the experts in this field, Dr. Robert Bjork. He says that the spacing effect is the finding that information that is presented repeatedly over spaced intervals is learned much better than information that is repeated without intervals, i.e. mass presentation. So what does this mean? Well, here's what this technique looks like visually. So as you can see in the top bar here, let's say you have a concept represented by A that you're trying to learn. And as you can see in the spaced method, you would leave time between each of 3 study sessions. Whereas in the massed method below, you have 3 consecutive study sessions without breaks, which is basically cramming. To put this in context, not all time is created equally. You would learn more by studying an hour tonight, an hour over the weekend, and an hour a week from now than you would by studying for 3 hours in a row. You know, this is really simple and powerful. You're putting in the same amount of time, but you're getting more out of it. I think I'm just going to take this microphone off so I can move around a little bit. Okay. One other thing about spacing is this. Reviewing things over increasingly spaced intervals is better than reviewing them over equally spaced intervals. So for example, you might want to study something a few times a week when you're first learning it, then once a week, then once every 2 weeks, then once a month, and so on. You should keep increasing the time between your study sessions. However, you shouldn't wait until you've forgotten something to review it, because then you'll just waste time relearning it. So why does spacing work? Well, researchers aren't entirely sure, but there are several possible reasons. It gives the material time to sink in. That's pretty obvious. It forces you to recall what you've learned, and it allows you to pinpoint and correct your misunderstandings. There's a related concept called interleaving, which is when you alternate between the study of different concepts. So interleaving and spacing really go hand in hand. You could say that interleaving makes spacing more efficient. So as you'll see in this top box here, in the interleaving section, let's say you have 3 concepts that you're trying to learn, A, B, and C. So in the interleaving box, it goes A, B, C, B, C, A, C, B, A. So as you can see, the study of concept A is still spaced, like you can see in the spacing experiment. But instead of doing nothing between these study sessions, you're studying these other concepts. And as a plus, all 3 concepts are spaced out. So here's a study that I think is a really good example of spacing and interleaving. In this study by Cornell and Bjork, undergraduate students learned the styles of 12 different artists by looking at 6 paintings by each artist. They studied half the paintings using massing, meaning that they looked at 6 paintings by one artist, then 6 paintings by another artist, and so on. As you can see in section A, where there are 6 paintings by the same artist. Then they studied the rest of the painters by using spacing and interleaving, meaning that the paintings they looked at were all mixed up, which is more like the section B on the bottom. The students were then shown new paintings by the same 12 artists and asked to identify who painted each work. So this shows the results of the study. The line in blue represents the painters studied with spacing, and the line in red below are the painters studied with massing. So as you can see, also there were 4 separate blocks of tests in which students got corrective feedback when they made mistakes. And even with this correction, spacing outperformed massing every time. One really surprising thing about this concept is that most people underestimate how effective spacing really is. After the experiment, the students were asked, Which do you think helped you learn more, massed or spaced presentation? And as you can see in these two columns on my left, the vast majority believed that massing was as good or better than spacing. But in reality, in terms of actual effectiveness, all of these bars in red, here, here, and here, were the students who actually did better with spacing than with massing. So the bottom line is that while massing may give you a feeling of confidence, you'll actually learn and retain much more with spacing. Now I'd like you to take a minute or two and try to think of some ways that you can add spacing and interleaving to your own everyday study sessions and practice. Think about what classes you have and what subjects you're studying, and think of some really concrete ways that you can apply these concepts. So if you could just take a minute, just maybe write some things down, and then I'll ask for a volunteer later. So one thing that I was actually going to show later is when you have flashcards, it's actually better to have more flashcards than fewer, because you'll have more cards in between each individual card, so that increases the spacing. So that, it's ironic, but the more cards you have, the better your learning things to learn. An effective strategy is to interleave one study. Study a little bit of history, then a little bit of psychology, followed by a chapter of statistics, and go back again to history. Repeat, best of in a blocked randomized order. And blocked randomized just means that you shouldn't study things in a set pattern every time. Some other things you can do is switch between math questions from different chapters when you're studying for a test, because this will force you to think about when to apply different math concepts. Also, if you're studying a foreign language, you should try alternating between things like speaking, writing, vocabulary, and so on. So I mean, there are tons of ways you... Exactly, I mean, taking a break is spacing. I mean, that's if we go back for a second, that's the slide, with the spacing experiment here. I mean, here you're studying the concepts A, but you are taking breaks in between each session. Versus interleaving, you're also studying A spaced out. You see it's A, B, C, B, C, A, C, B, A, but you're filling in that time with the other two concepts. So yeah, I mean, taking breaks definitely works, and I totally encourage taking breaks because it lets your brain rest and renew itself. But if you want to be super efficient, interleaving works because you're also mixing in your other subjects.